By August of 1867, there were 387 people here at Fort Jefferson. 313 were soldiers, 20 were civilians, and 54 were prisoners, including the conspirators. On August 19th, a soldier admitted himself to the Fort Hospital, still in the unfinished soldiers' barracks building. He was feeling ill, and it was hoped that he just had a case of breakbone fever. But soon, his skin turned yellow. 3 days later, he died, vomiting up black blood. Other soldiers quickly began to be admitted into the hospital, and soon it was very clear that the fort was under a yellow fever epidemic. Cases continued to spread as the days passed. Dr. Joseph Smith attempted to stop the spread of disease as best he could. Believing that the bedding of the infected was contagious, he had the casemates in which they were quartered boarded up. These casemates right here. Dr. Mudd and Edmund Spangler, who were part of the carpenter shop, aided in boarding up these casemates, but still the disease continued to spread. On September 1st, Dr. Joseph Smith reopened the isolation hospital located on Sand Key, now known as Hospital Key, that little piece of land right over my shoulder. There he sent members of the infected companies in hope to isolate and prevent the disease from spreading. But Dr. Smith knew he was out of his element in fighting the yellow fever. He had only arrived at the fort a month before and had no practical experience with yellow fever, just what he had read in books. Still, he dutifully tried the best he could to care for the sick as the cases continued to increase.
One would think the initial reaction of the conspirators would be that of fear, as they watched multiple men fall sick to the dreaded disease they had heard about but had not experienced firsthand until now. However, in a September 3rd letter home, Dr. Mudd stated that the prisoners seemed to feel no alarm. On the contrary, Dr. Mudd hoped that this epidemic would work to his benefit. He wrote to his wife his hope that the whole fort would be evacuated to mainland Key West on account of the plague. Despite Dr. Mudd's hopes, the military never issued a full evacuation of Fort Jefferson, and so he and the rest of the prisoners remained stuck there.
Dr. Joseph Smith fell ill with yellow fever on September 5th. The fort was now without a doctor. A ship was dispatched to Key West to find another one, but hope was 2 days away, if some came at all. Major Valentine Stone, the commander of Fort Jefferson at this time, approached Dr. Mudd and asked him if he would render aid to the fort in their time of need. Dr. Mudd was hesitant. He wrote of the spite he felt toward the government that had put him here, and he was worried about what would happen to him if patients he cared for died under his medical care. In the end, Dr. Mudd agreed to help. He took over for the failing Dr. Smith. His first suggestion was to eliminate the long open water journey from here to Hospital Key for those patients who had already been infected with yellow fever. He also ordered that these casemates, located what was behind the hospital portion of the soldier barracks building, be boarded up and used as an additional ward for the increasing number of sick soldiers and civilians. Dr. Mudd was on his own tending to the sick from September 5th until September 7th, when a doctor arrived from Key West. That doctor was this man, Dr. Daniel Whitehurst, buried here in Key West Cemetery. During the 1850s, Dr. Whitehurst had lived on the Dry Tortugas when he acted as the post doctor. When the Civil War broke out, he came back to the mainland to live. During his time as the fort's doctor in the 1850s, Dr. Whitehurst had seen yellow fever before. Thus, his arrival was a godsend to Dr. Mudd. Dr. Whitehurst took over as the lead doctor, but Dr. Mudd wasn't done helping out. He continued to act as an assistant doctor to nurse and care for the sick and the dying. Dr. Joseph Sims Smith, the original post doctor, died of yellow fever on September 8, 1867. This was in spite of the best of care that Drs. Mudd and Whitehurst gave him. Dr. Smith's wife also fell ill with yellow fever, but through their care, she managed to survive. The same could not be said for the couple's young son, a 3.5-year-old named Henry Price Smith, who died on September 18th. In the aftermath of the yellow fever epidemic, the 5th U.S. Artillery, who were present here when Dr. Smith was caring for them, erected this beautiful memorial tablet to Dr. Smith and his son. It stands in the middle of the parade grounds. Cases of yellow fever continue to mount, with officers and their families consisting of a disproportionate amount of the deaths. Major Stone, the commander of this base, lost his wife on September 21st. In an effort to save his young son, he and his son evacuated to Key West, only for Major Stone to fall sick of the disease and die there on the 24th. Quickly thereafter, 2 more officers on the fort died of yellow fever, and by September 26, Dr. Mudd wrote that there are only 2 officers left in the whole fortress, one about to die and one just finally recovering from yellow fever.
Dr. Mudd wrote soberly of the increasingly necessary act of burying the dead on nearby Bird Key.
You can't imagine the gloom and indifference which pervades the whole garrison. No more respect is shown the dead, be he officer or soldier, than the putrid remains of a dead dog. The burial party are allowed a drink of whiskey both before and after the burying, which infuses a little more life in them. They move quickly, and in half an hour after a man dies, he's put in a coffin, nailed down, carried to a boat, rowed a mile to an adjacent island, the grave dug, covered up, and the party returned, in the best of humor for their drinks. Such are life and scenes in the Tortugas.
On September 26, a new doctor arrived and relieved Dr. Whitehurst. At this point, the fever was starting to slow down, but only, according to Dr. Mudd, because of a lack of victims. So many men had been sent to the nearby keys to isolate and hopefully keep them safe. Cases continued to decline over the next month, but the last person didn't recover from yellow fever until November 14th.
The conspirators and the other prisoners were not immune to the disease. Samuel Arnold caught it early, but rather than have him go to the hospital, Dr. Mudd tended to his cellmate in their quarters. By September 17th, Arnold had recovered. The conspirators' friend and fellow state prisoner, Colonel Grenfell, had acted as a nurse alongside Dr. Mudd. He became sick from the fever, but he also recovered with Dr. Mudd's help. After weeks of caring for others, Dr. Mudd came down with yellow fever on October 4th. According to Samuel Arnold, the new post doctor never once came and checked in on Mudd during his illness. Instead, Arnold and Edmund Spangler cared for the doctor in their cell. They replicated the care the doctor had given Arnold in his illness until he too made a recovery. Dr. Mudd wrote appreciatively of his cellmates and how they watched over him as though he was their brother.
Out of the 270 cases of yellow fever during the 1867 epidemic, there were 38 deaths. One of those deaths was conspirator Michael O'Laughlin. Out of all the conspirators, he's the one we know the least about. He left no writings that we know of his time here at Fort Jefferson. And really, the bulk of the information we know about him is about his illness and death. And this comes from Dr. Mudd's letters home.
September 17th. O'Laughlin has yellow fever now and is getting along very well. September 19th. O'Laughlin is improving. I tend him in our room. September 21st. O'Laughlin was getting along very well up until yesterday evening when, owing to the imprudence of some visitor giving account of the recent deaths, he became excited, sank into a collapse, and with difficulty we could save his life up to the present. He has revived considerably, but is yet in a critical condition. Our attention is unremitted, and assure his friends he shall suffer for nothing. We have now by his side all the delicacies the island can afford. Later on September 21st, O'Laughlin had a convulsion a few minutes ago. My heart almost fails me, but I must say he is dying. September 23rd. O'Laughlin died this morning. We did all that was possible, but our efforts were in vain. We prolonged his suffering life for 2 days by constant nursing and attention.
At the end of the epidemic, Dr. Mudd wrote a full report of the disease and the actions he had taken. In that report, he also once again mentions the death of O'Laughlin.
He, unfortunate young man, away from his family and friends by whom he was most tenderly loved, fell a victim to the pestilence in spite of every effort on our part to save him. He had passed the first stage of the disease and was apparently convalescent. But, contrary to my earnest advice, he got out of bed a short time after I left in the morning and was walking around the room looking over some periodicals the greater part of the day. In the evening, around 5 o'clock, a sudden collapse of the vital powers took place, which in 36 hours after terminated his life. He seemed all at once conscious of his impending fate. The first warning I had of his condition was his exclamation, "Doctor, doctor, you must tell my mother all." He then called Edmund Spangler, who was present, and extending his hand said, "Goodbye, Ned." These were his last words of consciousness. O'Laughlin dead, stain upon the country. I and all labored day and night to save him, but in vain. vital spark was too weak, and he yielded in quiet submission to the omnipotent hand of Providence.
Like the others who perished from yellow fever, Michael O'Loughlin's body was placed in a pine box and transported about a mile southwest to Bird Key. Here, he was buried in a grave upon the sandy island. Bird Key slowly eroded away over the years and finally sank into the sea in 1935. But luckily, O'Loughlin was not doomed to a watery grave. In 1870, 3 years after his death, O'Loughlin's family requested that his body be shipped home. An order was given, and soldiers at the fort disinterred O'Loughlin's coffin from Bird Key. The soldiers who completed the task reported that O'Loughlin had been buried deeper than most upon the key, and that his coffin had been thoroughly saturated with salt water. In order to fit the remains into an airtight metal case for shipping, it was necessary to cut off part of the wooden coffin. When this was done, the soldiers noted the blanket in which the deceased was enveloped seemed to be in a good state of preservation, and the general form of the body well defined. It was not deemed advisable to pursue the examination further than this. The remains were sealed up and shipped to Baltimore. On December 14, 1870, Michael O'Loughlin was reburied in his family's plot in Greenmount Cemetery.
Dr. Mudd was deeply affected by the loss of Michael O'Loughlin. He wrote of him, "I never met with one more kind and forbearing, possessing a warm, friendly disposition and a fine, comprehensive intellect. I enjoyed greater ease in conversational intercourse with him than any of my prison associates." Perplexingly, while Sam Arnold also wrote about the yellow fever epidemic in his memoir 30 years later, he never once mentions the illness and death of O'Loughlin. Perhaps even so long after the fact, the death of his cellmate and friend was too traumatic for Arnold to recount.
Even before the fever subsided, Dr. Mudd was thinking about how the events might be used in his favor. Mudd mourned the death of the post commander, Major Stone, because Stone had promised to tell the authorities of Mudd's services. The doctor hoped that such a report would help gain his release. In the end, Dr. Mudd found that Major Stone was not his only advocate. Other members of the garrison, grateful at the doctor's tender care during a terrifying time, wrote up a petition on Dr. Mudd's behalf. They noted Dr. Mudd's bravery and selflessness in taking over when Dr. Smith fell ill, and how Dr. Mudd continued to attend patients even after Dr. Whitehurst arrived from Key West. In the end, 257 of the soldiers stationed at Fort Jefferson signed a petition calling for clemency in Dr. Mudd's case due to his brave service. This petition was forwarded to Washington, but for the time being, it was not acted on in any way. Dr. Mudd continued to write and pray for his eventual release.